Soka, Devika, Kin, all of these people helped me bring me to my scholarly endeavors. And I would like to start with a quote first from the Southeast Asian Solidarity Toolkit that was released this late October. That quote, "The Release Minnesota 8 campaign is made up of family members and supports of 8 Cambodian Minnesota men who were detained by ICE in August of 2016. Most of the relatives in the campaign are women who had the first-hand experience of keeping a family afloat after a father, a husband, a breadwinner, and a caretaker was taken away by an unjust immigration system. The Minnesota 8 were resettled with their families in the United States as refugees after fleeing war and genocide in the 1980s. After spending most of their lives in the United States and growing as men, they faced deportation to a country they barely knew. 3 of the Minnesota 8 individuals were able to come back home to their spouses, to their children, to their parents, while 5 were deported." And that's a quote from the toolkit. So Cambodian Americans have been getting deported since 2002, and in 2017, the United States has begun reinterpreting the MUA that was signed between US and Vietnam in 2008, or repatriation agreement, promising that pre-1995 refugees would not be deported. But also, organizers have already seen the disappearance of pre-1995 Vietnamese refugees into ICE, but also in late July, Trump has already imposed sanctions on other Southeast Asian countries such as Laos and Burma. Southeast Asians, I argue, are facing a hidden immigration crisis. According to CRAC, or the Southeast Asian Resource Action Center, there are over 16,000 Southeast Asians with final orders of removal. Southeast Asians, I argue then, from all this, I argue, what does an abolitionist practice for Southeast Asian refugee communities entail? So I moved to look to Release Minnesota 8 as an organization to examine for abolition. Release Minnesota 8 was a grassroots organization that formed in 2016 to stop the deportation of 8 Cambodian men from Minnesota. These 8 families rallied together to challenge individual narratives of the carceral state, and each members were. The campaign was organized primarily by the wives, the women, and queer folk to challenge both U.S. empire and ICE. After successfully stopping the deportation of 3 of the 8 Cambodian men, a toolkit was formed. A toolkit called the Southeast Asian Solidarity Immigration Toolkit. For this paper, I examined the abolitionist futures that are entailed within the toolkit. For Release Minnesota 8, they formed the toolkit to, quote, understand both organizational and legal strategies to fight against Southeast Asian deportation. Yet I argue, end quote. Yet I argue through the focus of Crimmigration that Southeast Asians can produce and formulate a notion of solidarities with other communities. Yet, for this working paper, I focus on the development of the deportable refugee through imperial statecraft, that deportation acts as a double punishment for the criminal alien, or the Cambodian refugee. But I argue that this display of necropolitical control is intertwined with the very fabric that is the essence of Cambodian refugee sociality. Insofar, this operation of the settler state is a reflection of the way in which militarism and coloniality continue to haunt Cambodian American sociality, or to quote Dylan Rodriguez, proliferating war technologies, or what I entail and call militarized managerialisms. And the nation-state's maintenance of Cambodian refugees operates as an emphasic response to the American War and the Vietnam War. But I also argue that is a double move to settler innocence. As Harsha Wuli argues, or quote, by invoking the state itself as a victim, immigrants themselves are cast out as illegal and criminals by committing the assault on the state. Or simply put, Cambodian refugees are deportable because their existence is an uncanny reminder of imperial violence in Southeast Asia, which delegitimizes the nation-state for liberal democracy. I root my analysis within the emerging fields of critical refugee studies, and I try to bridge critical refugee studies with carceral studies, or critical carceral studies, to understand the relationship between U.S. empire, militarism, and carcerality. Southeast Asians, I think, are particularly helpful to understand the effects of the nation-state, liberalism, and racial assimilation. I follow a Spiritus project to understand that both within the toolkit, that these depictions of personal affect and bodies of or what she labels as bodies of knowledge are often pushed aside in research, but these personal stories from women, queer folk, and survivors of the carceral state are what root in abolitionist practice for Southeast Asian refugees. I'm gonna just end it there because it gets more nitty-gritty about the paper, and I would rather leave more time for discussion. So if you wanted to have more space for that, you can ask. So.